good afternoon, good morning from wherever you are. It's good to try and get a book in for a book review, just a discussion about the books that I'm currently reading. So, I just finished a book called Good Strategy, Bad Strategy by famous strategist by the name of Richard Rumelt. It was a book prescribed to me by my previous employer, and I never got to read it because I didn't have the functional capability or the time necessary to read it. But I'm currently pursuing my LLD at a prestigious university in China, and I thought, okay, while I'm trying to plan my own life, let me read a book that makes sense that my employer had subscribed. So it's called Good Strategy, Bad Strategy, and the Difference and Why It Matters. And I want to just read like one or two takeaways. So in the praise for good strategy, bad strategy, so someone said this book will enable you to think the way you think and also improve your performance. Someone said this is the first book on strategy read that I found difficult to put down. I agree with that. Easy to read and avoids the pretentious, overblown jargon which often renders great ideas and insights inaccessible. And then there's one from John Stopford, Emeritus for London Business School, who says, a milestone in both theory and practice of strategy. Everyone involved in creating and applying strategy and strategic thing must read this book. So it's an international bestseller, and I thought, okay, let me read and share. So the thing that I'm going to start with is what Richard Rumelt considered a good strategy. So things to consider when you have a good strategy. So I listed as a checklist of good strategy. So this is based on throughout the book what he said, what it means to have good strategy. So not defining what a strategy is or what the difference. At first, I did my own exercise, which is that. So before I begin with what the book is about, let me talk about what I did with the checklist. So with the checklist, so every time I saw what he said, I wrote it down. So I have a list of 40. There's some that are maybe a bit inaudible or illegible, so I might not be able to read them, but the ones that I do have, I will share. So I have a list of 43. Yeah, there might be more, I always have missed something. So checklist for good strategy. A good strategy is that which defines a critical challenge and action. It has a good chance of being accomplished. It requires hard work. It's about figuring out which purpose that are both worth pursuing and capable of being accomplished. Analyzing the true challenges and opportunities faced by a client in this case. Good strategy has 3 kernel elements: diagnosis, guiding policy, 3 sets, a set of actions. It also asks why and how you're doing it. A good strategy creates advantage and magnifies the effect of resources and actions. A good strategy is about doing something. A good strategy is deciding what truly is important and focusing on resources and actions on that objective. A good strategy provides an essential amount of coordination. A good strategy harnesses power and applies it where it will have the greatest effect. A good strategy magnifies the effectiveness of actions and by figuring out and using the sources of power. So the sources of power: leverage, proximity, objectives, chain link systems, design, focus, growth and advantage, dynamics, and a fight against inertia and randomness. A good strategy harnesses power and applies where it will have the greatest effect. A good strategy harnesses effectiveness in actions. A good strategy is about choice and decisions, and what the master strategist has designed. A good strategy is when it's companies that defy logic and market monopoly. Companies that defy the logical market, so monopolies, the ruler, the specialized supplier, the power broker, the kings, the treasury. A good strategy is Pascal's strategy. It is quality and brand. It competes on quality, brand, and for lifetime value not on the price. A good strategy attacks another industry. A good strategy is design, and design is about fitting various pieces together so they work as one coherent whole. A good strategy uses advantage, with some advantage being more advantageous than others. A good strategy strips other layers, maintains the coherence of design, uses the science of strategy. A good strategy is built on functional knowledge and what works and what doesn't. A good strategy is a hypothesis about what will work, an educated judgment. A good strategy must have an entrepreneurial component and embraces a combination of research and for deciding new risks and opportunities. A good strategy is something that sets aside comfort and security, but launches into murkier waters of induction, analogy, judgment, and insights. 31. 32. A good strategy is a scientific hypothesis, an educated prediction of how the world works. A good strategy looks at the intensely action and to data and what works. A good strategy is a thing that's required a radical change in a consumer's tastes and habits. It's a good strategy is that which makes something others do not control and assure and outsource of source and a valuable resource. A good strategy, you must perceive and take into account what others are not. A good strategy is long-termedness, not short-sightedness. A good strategy deserves more than a quick closure. It makes a good judgment. A good strategy is that which makes an ability to think about what your own thinking to make judgment about your own judgment. A good strategy has a great deal of knowledge about the specifics. A good strategy is a good judgment. It's a good strategy. It's an implied action. A good strategy is independent and careful assessment of the situation, carefully crafted purpose. So those are the 43 things I got down for what is considered a good strategy. But what the author does initially in his book is that he separates the books into 3 parts, defining what is a good strategy and a bad strategy. That's the part 1. And then part 2, he says what are sources of power. So what would be considered a source of power for a good strategy, and then how to think like a strategist is part 3. So it's divided into 3 parts with long parts. So he firstly challenged, so this book was written in 2011, so that's about, this is 2026, that is about 25 years ago. No, my sister, 14 years ago. 14 years ago. No, it's so weird. 14 years ago. So it's the climate is different. The internet is still not overused. There's no Instagram overuse, but people are being introduced to it. Facebook has surrendered its power. So there's a lot of conventional thinking, and it's the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis. So people have a lot of experience. So he says in the beginning that a good strategy is something that is unexpected. So because lots of organizations think that they're having a good strategy, but it's so rare that it's very unexpected to have a good strategy. So he provides a lot of examples of what is unexpected actions and companies that do it very well. And then something that's unexpected. So, for example, what he talks about is the Desert Storm attack in Iraq. So, how it was executed. So, left hook Desert Storm. It's about eliminating distractions and focusing. Then you see in chapter 2 he talks about discovering power, and he argues that effectively using your strengths against your weaknesses. So how to do that? He provides a case study, and then chapter 3 he talks about what is considered a bad strategy. So it's like bad strategy is fluff. It's full of fluff. Poorly thought out strategy based on misconception and misguided leadership. So, fluff, failure to face the challenge, mistaking goals for strategy, bad strategic objectives. And then he asked the question in chapter 4, why so much bad strategy? So he says that there are 3 pathways that lead to bad strategy. So one is the inability to choose, template style strategy. So everyone doing the same thing, like reducing strategy to fill a blanks of visions and mission statements, which is often the business school startup. So he jumps at that, and then failing to have new thoughts. So that's something that he's saying that thinking about success creates success. So that's important. And then chapter 5, he introduces what he considers a good strategy. So the 43 things that I have written down as good strategy, he breaks them down into 3 key elements. So the kernel, so 3 essentials. There was a diagnosis, a truthful and simplified exploration of the nature of the challenge. This is not a list of goals, but a definition of the nature of the challenge that names a disease or pathology. A guiding policy, an overall approach chosen to overcome with the obstacle to identify the diagnosis. This is not a vague aspiration, but a specific direction. A coherent action, a set of coordinated actions designed to carry out the guiding policy. These actions must be coherent and they must fit together and reinforce each other. So kernels are diagnosis, guiding policy, coherent action. So in every example he gives where this is in fact, he even at this point asks us to go to Nvidia microchips and how they came up with the diagnosis, guiding policy, and coherent action in order to be one of the biggest companies we know of today. And then he says, where does good strategy get its source of power? So first and foremost, he looks at the fact that it uses leverage. It looks at the fact that leverage identifies the critical pivotal point, applies concentrated action, uses asymmetry very well. So exploit what your competitor easily cannot counter. Proximate objective, so that is near achievable goals. So that is not something that's far, something that's manageable. No grand visions, something that is clearly manageable and can be reached. Then he says in chapter 8 that the chain link systems, that one needs the other to be strengthened. So in that chain, he says, strengthen the weakest link. So that's the most important thing about chain links are important. And this is what he gives another case study, which is Walmart, and how Kmart decentralized model means the links were not connected and the whole system was weak. So, but whereas Walmart only worked because every link, the supplier, the warehouses, the trucks, the stores, and inventory system functioned together. So create chain links. Then in chapter 9, he looks at design, which I thought was the most interesting chapter, in that he says design is a deliberate arrangement of resources and actions to achieve a purpose. He says that strategy is fundamentally a design problem, not a planning problem. So you start with the desired outcome. You work backwards to identify what must be true to the outcome to occur. Design action, resource allocations to make those actions true. So work backwards. So he looks at that and says that it's achievable. Then chapter 10, he says focus. Narrow down the set of objectives. You can't do everything. That which is critical, that requires deep expertise. Focus provides clarity for employers and stakeholders. And focus make trade-offs explicit and manageable. So he looks at that. Then in chapter 11, he looks at growth. I like that his growth is something that is not always good. So he challenges the misconception that growth is always good. Growth with us strategy is destructive. It disperses relocation and creates complexity that undermines performance. So you must always ask yourself, growth of what? For what purpose? At what cost? then he looks at the example and says profitable growth comes from competitive advantage, not from growth for growth's sake. So companies that pursue growth without advantage, they destroy their value. Okay. Then using advantage. Use advantage is a position of superiority that allows an organization to outperform competitors. He argues that good strategy exploits and deepens advantage. So you have information, you know something, you position yourself and what you're capable, and then you scale it as reward, and it's renewed and deepened over time. So chapter 13 examines dynamics and refers to the changes in the competitive environment. So then good strategy anticipates, as I said, exploits dynamically that are simply react instead of simply reacting to them. And then chapter 14, which I thought was very difficult, inertia, and I just need to go to this portion because really I dug very deeply when I was reading inertia and entropy. So he said that it will take you years to alter a company's basic function into order into disorder. This is inertia. And so it makes it necessary for leaders to constrain, work on, maintain organization's purpose, form, and methods. So what it happens is that entropy, which is measuring the lack of order that exists in a system. So he says that inertia makes a company resistant to change. This is where it's always been done. So in a tendency that organizations persist in established routines even though they're no longer effective. Entropy is companies' tendency towards disorder, so disorganization, internal friction. It is a slow breakdown of coordination, clarity, and alignment. So he says neither inertia or entropy is inevitable. Good strategy provides energy that counters both. So you always have entropy and inertia, but good strategy counters that. So for example, what I looked at when I was looking at this case is how ESCOM, SOE in South Africa, did a turnaround fighting inertia. It's going through it, and this is how it's always been done mindset. So now, how do you change that? And entropy, how do you restore maintenance and operational discipline? So the change that's currently happening in that environment and seeing it in action, how these internal enemies can actually destroy a company, but with good strategy, you can counter this effect on the company. So so corporate leadership must work to maintain a coherent design to avoid coherence being lost, be willing to remedy this, be aware of entropy combined with inertia due to the absolute routine, frozen culture, and chain link systems. So he uses Nevada as an example again, which a diagnosis of guiding policy and had coherent actions on how to move forward, which I think was really another good example. In chapter 15, he speaks about putting it together. So how do you put it together? So how you synthesize the source of coherent framework. The source of power is not standalone, it's integrated into a single coherent strategy, diagnosis, choosing a guiding policy, designing coherent, leveraging sources of power, counter inertia and entropy. So that strategy is not just a checklist, it is a design that incorporates all elements of the whole. Then in the last chapter, last part of the book, he looks at thinking like a strategist. So how do you then think what do you do to think like a strategist? So I thought this was interesting. I somewhat didn't fully agree with his things, but he says strategy is again something that you observe the situation, formulate the diagnosis, you design the coherent action, you test the hypothesis, execute and learn, and you revise based on results. So it's not about having the right answer, it's about having the testable hypothesis and being willing to learn from failure. So he says capturing proprietary information, testing the hypothesis, and he gives a good example of Ben, let me see, Ben Howard Schultz. Howard Schultz. And one of the founder members of Starbucks. So how he came to test the hypothesis and how he came to know it better than anyone else. And then chapter 17, he says, use your head. So his good strategy focuses on cognitive skills, and what it does, it questions assumptions. So you don't just accept things as they are. It's how it's always done. You question, you see patterns, you recognize that this is how it's done. You think in systems specifically and not just ideas. You make trade-offs explicit. You acknowledge what you are giving up all the time. That's kind of interesting. It's not natural. It's a discipline that can only be developed through practice. So he's saying that that's what a good strategy is. So just to completely, you practice judgment, knowing yourself, your abilities, and what issues to expect to arise in the meeting. You'll take which is position to commit yourself in issue in advance. Commit your judgments in writing. And then the final chapter is keeping your head. It says clearly, he says, don't allow social herding and the inside view. And to judge the truth, you must go beyond the system outside knowledge. You must keep your head. He says that he addresses psychological and organizational challenges. He says, maintain a clear mind. Don't adjust to pressure. Don't be fearful. Obtain optimism towards bias. Believe things will work without a plan. Stop believing things will work without a plan. They work because of a plan. And don't allow groupthink. So this is he's critic towards the 2008 financial crisis, and he says keep your head is means of maintaining the discipline and clear your mind even when under pressure. It means being willing to face unpleasant truths, make hard choices, and stay focused on what matters. So the ultimate test is that a good strategy is not a document, it is a living guide that shapes decisions and actions every day. It requires constant attention, renewal, revision, and renewal. So, but he emphasized this from the chapter 1 that a good strategy is not just a list; it's that which has a diagnosis, a coherent design, and action. Let me go back to clearly the most important thing. Diagnosis, a guiding policy, a coherent design, which is a coherent design, and that overall, what is really, ask yourself firstly, what is really going on here? What will you do about it? And how will you make it happen? So that's broadly how I read the book, and I thought about all the 3 parts and 3 chapters, and I liked the book, but it's from 2011. So between then and now, a lot has changed, especially in business. But I think you can consider this book that from someone with a lot of a lot of experience in terms of life experience. So he went from an engineer for NASA to a consultant in various organizations. So I'm looking at like a long thing. He's one of the world's most influential thinkers of strategy and management. He's been profiled by The Economist as one of the 55 women who have most significant impact on management concept and corporate practice. And he was described as a strategist, a giant in strategy. So he has a MSc in electrical engineering. He was a system design engineer. He got an MBA, etc., etc. And so he thinks about this, and his book, the next book is 2022, and it's called The Crux, and it's really an interesting resource for strategy, but it's also an interesting resource for life, and it's not just for industry. And he did a lot of empirical work to get onto to get to this book, and it's richly, as someone said, based on his own experience, a milestone for both theory and practice of strategy. And it's a good guide. It's a book to go back to every so often. If you are in the language of business, but it's a good book to go back to in the language of success. And so I would highly recommend this book for employees and people aiming to richly be successful, and importantly also for entrepreneurs. So because strategy, it requires entrepreneurship. So thank you for listening through this 26 minutes of my good strategy, bad strategy review. I enjoyed this book, and I'm thankful for my previous employer for suggesting it, and I do hope to speak more about it in the future. Okay, thank you.